Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm back with another seasonal doodle. This will be the last season, which is spring, but I'm going to hopefully think of other ideas in the future. So let's get started. Like usual, I'm going to begin by sketching all the elements out. Of course, you can add on other elements you want to. For this particular one though, just to make it consistent all throughout the doodle, I decided to pick a specific theme, which will be spring picnic. I know some of you like to garden as well, so that could also be a topic you might want to create, and I might even try it out as well for another season. Here I started out by sketching a flowy dress at the center. If you decided to pick another topic though, like gardening, you can also make gardening attire as your focal point. I just find that clothing takes a bit of space to doodle with all the details, and it's just nice to place it at the center. As you can see, my line work is still pretty messy at this point. You guys know that I don't really like to plan for these types of doodles, but I like to enjoy the trial and error approach and just working on it at my own pace. After drawing out the dress as the focal point, I like to think of other picnic related items and scatter them around the dress. I'm not too worried about the size at this point. I just want to get my ideas on paper at this point and see if they work together in the given space. If it's a bit hard for you to think of ideas before sketching out the outline, you can also do a small brainstorm and write down a list of items related to the topic that you've picked, and maybe even think of how you're going to doodle the items very roughly, which might make this part of the process a bit less intimidating if it's a bit difficult for you to face a completely blank page. For this doodle, I thought of things I would bring or have in a picnic, like the types of foods or drinks. Of course, I'm going to add flowers, books, and also a ukulele, which I'm sketching out right here, which I'm going to decorate with a bit of spring features. As I'm doodling these items, I'm trying to sketch the objects very lightly so it's easier to erase without damaging the paper, making sure that I don't place too much pressure on the paper from the pencil. And it's also okay if the sketch is a little bit messy at this point. In fact, I try to break down the objects using smaller shapes as guidelines, and I don't really clean too much off the scratchiness as long as it's not too distracting to the whole composition. I know what I'm sketching here is kind of unplanned and a little bit messy, but if this is something that you've planned ahead prior to sketching, or you would like to recreate the same composition, I would recommend for you to sketch out the larger items first, then add the smaller items in between so it's a bit easier to space out the objects. And if there are any small awkward spaces, I would either decorate the space with some small leaves, flowers, or tiny fruits. These filler items will greatly depend on your own composition and how you've spaced out the items, so this will greatly differ from one composition to another. Sometimes I also like to add the fillers after I've painted the composition, and if I feel I realize there's a bit of small space that needs to be filled, then I would just add it on along the way. I also realize as I'm voiceovering that cakes are probably one of the main things you bring to a picnic to have with your tea, especially for a cute spring picnic. And I think it will also look cute with the rest of the composition, so you might want to switch out some of the objects to include it in. Maybe you can replace it with the cheese board on the top left with a piece of strawberry shortcake. Once I'm done with the pencil sketch, sometimes I like to paint certain items first, especially if I feel I would forget to add certain details that I want to leave out without an outline. But in this case, I feel it's pretty safe to outline most of the items I have here, so I'm using my waterproof Sakura Micron pen. This is in sepia and it's the lightest weight, which is 0.5. I'm going to outline all of the items except for the flowers because I don't want to be restricted by the outline when I'm personally painting flowers. Instead, I want the outline to support the painting instead, which is why I'm going to add the outline later for the flowers. But if you feel like the outline will actually help you paint the flowers, you can also outline them first and use the method that is most comfortable for you. If you notice, my initial pencil sketches are quite messy and actually very simplified. That's because I'm going to add on the details and textures to certain objects as I'm outlining here. So as an example, I added more detail to the sandwich, like a layer of lettuce and ham. I also added the crust as well as the rim of the jar. I'm also going to add simplified textures to the baskets. There are two baskets. Well, one of them is a bread basket and the one on the right is sort of like a handbag. And I'm just going to suggest the texture of a woven basket using small horizontal and vertical lines. I skipped the one on the left here, but I'll draw it on the handbag on the right. And I am also going to add diagonal twists to the handles and the edges of the baskets. If you feel uncomfortable doing all of these added details and texture freehand, you can also draw it out with pencil first, but I would recommend for you to get the basic outline of the composition as you're sketching with pencil before drawing out the details. This way, if you make a mistake, it's a bit easier to erase and you don't need to redraw every single detail over again. By the way, if you like this composition and you would like to recreate it but can't be bothered sketching from scratch, I'll have this outline available in my coffee shop, and at this point, I'll just keep outlining the rest of the items, then I'll get back to you once I'm done. Once I'm done with all the outlines, I'm going to erase the pencil marks. But as for the flowers, which I'm going to leave out the pencil marks of, I tried to make the outline a bit cleaner with my pencil, and then I tap my eraser to lighten the pencil marks so I can hide the pencil outline behind my paint. Next, I'm going to go over the colors I'll be using for this doodle. This is Chinese White by Holbein, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Gray of Grey by Holbein, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Sepia by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, Permanent Green by Holbein, Sap Green by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, and Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martens. I seem to have left out one color, and that is Crimson Lake by Holbein. So let's begin to paint. I'm going to start out by painting the flowers first. See how my pencil outline is very light, and starting out with a tulip, I want to create a peachy color, so I used a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium, Vermilion with a little bit of Chinese White to make the color a little bit more pastel. And while the surface is still wet, I use a medium consistency sap green to connect it to the sepals underneath, as well as the stem and the leaves. I'm going to leave that out to dry and move on to the mimosas. For the mimosas, I use a yellow color. I find that Hansa Yellow Medium is a little bit too light, so I added a bit of vermilion to make the yellow more orangey. I then dried off the circles that I initially painted and used a little bit more vermilion in the mix to create a slightly darker orangey color and paint in between the circles that I've already painted earlier so it looks like they're overlapping each other. I also added this darker yellow orangey color underneath some of the circles just to give a little bit of dimension to the circles. For the leaves, I added the mimosa mix to the sap green. I like to use the tip of my brush to create a wavy line which suggests the stem, and I added more lines on either side angling upwards or towards the tip of the stem for the leaves. Then I'm going to layer on a slightly darker green for shadow and a bit of dimension. For the green, I added Crimson Lake into the mix to create a darker green, and I use a very thick consistency to paint on the same shades for the leaves. As for the paper wrap, I just use yellow ochre and I'm just going to paint it on, leaving a little bit of white negative space as the paper overlaps each other. I'm also going to layer on a bit of a thicker consistency as shadows and also use a slightly darker mix, so that's from sepia and yellow ochre to create more of the full texture. As for the string, I just use a thick consistency of sepia. By the way, for the string as well as the leaves or any small areas, you can always switch to a smaller brush. My brush here is fairly new, so the tip is still very pointy, which is why I can still paint very fine lines without switching my brush. Now moving on to the flowers next to the bread basket. For the white or the petals of the flower, I use gray of gray. For the middle, I use a mix of Hansa yellow and vermilion to create an orange. As for the leaves, I use the same dark green mix from the mimosa leaves. I don't want to paint the flowers with too much detail, so I'm just going to leave it here and start drawing on the outline. I do want to make sure that everything is completely dry first though, if not you might risk the pen bleeding into the water. I decided to add a bit of frilly texture for this flower, so I added really short lines placed inside of the petals facing the center. With the bouquet of mimosas, I'm going to outline the paper wrap first. I also want to add some lines to create the folds, and for the mimosas, I try my best to figure out the individual flowers, but I'm going to leave out the leaves. Meanwhile, I realized that I left out the details of the bread basket, so here I just added the rim and the bottom of the basket, as well as the small horizontal and vertical lines to suggest a woven pattern. Next, I'm going to paint the grapes. I want the color to be more of a yellow-green, so I use a mix of permanent green with a little bit of yellow ochre just to lighten it. I chose to use yellow ochre instead of Hansa yellow because yellow ochre has more of a muted tone, and I don't want the green to be overly too bright. I also painted using the tip of my brush, but you can also use a small brush for this. And I also left out some white negative space as highlight to make the grape look plump. As for the leaves, I added the yellow-green to the darker green mix from before, and I used this color to just paint flatly for the leaves as well as the grapes, which are hidden behind, to give the grapes a little bit more three-dimensional form. I'm going to paint the bread basket. For the basket, I use a mix of yellow ochre, gray of gray, and a little bit of sepia to darken and mute the color. And I'm going to use a medium consistency to paint the basket, and don't forget to paint the areas behind the flowers and the leaves as well. I'm going to leave the basket to dry and move on to the hat. I'm going to use yellow ochre to paint the top part of the hat, and for the bottom fold, I use the same mix as the bread basket. Then I moved on to paint the basket on the right hand side. I used yellow ochre for the sides and the top, and for the handle I used the same mix as the bread basket but with a bit more sepia. For the inside, I'm going to use the exact same color but in a slightly thinner consistency, so the handle still looks darker than the rest. I'm going to move on to paint another brown area to paint the platter for the cheese and crackers. For this, I used a mix of yellow ochre, vermilion, and a little bit of sepia to darken it. You can also use the lighter brown if you want, but I want to vary the color a little bit more, so I decided to make the platter with a darker wood instead. As for the cheese knife, I just used yellow ochre for the handle and gray of gray for the metal part. Next are the books. I'm going to use buff titanium to paint the pages, and for the pile of books on the left hand side, I added a little bit of yellow ochre to darken the buff titanium slightly. The load on my brush here was pretty heavy and wet, so I'm going to leave that to dry and move on to paint the teacups. I'm just going to use gray of gray to paint the base color while leaving out a little bit of white negative space. Then I'm going to leave that out to dry and move on to paint the sandwich. For the bread, I use a mix of yellow ochre and gray of gray in a very light consistency. Then I use the same dark brown mix as the cheese platter, which is from yellow ochre, sepia, and vermilion to paint the crust. And I'm going to leave that out to dry before I paint on the filling. So while I wait, I'm going to move on to paint the dress. I use buff titanium to paint the base color all over the whole dress, which gives more of a white creamy color. But if you want the dress to look more white, you can either use gray of gray or leave it completely white, then use gray of gray just for the folds and plaits of the skirt. I need to layer on more colors to paint on the folds, so I need to wait for the dress to dry. So I'm jumping to another area, which is the ukulele. I use yellow ochre to paint the front side of the ukulele and use the same dark brown mix as the cheese platter with added sepia to paint the sides and the whole. After this, I'm going to go back to the dress again. For the folds, I'm going to use a mix of gray of gray, buff titanium, yellow ochre with a tiny bit of sepia. I want to make sure everything is completely dry. Then I use this color in a very thick consistency to paint the inside part of the dress and also the cast shadow for the bottom layer. I then use a slightly thinner consistency to paint the folds for the skirt as well as the frilly sleeves. I'm going to leave the dress to dry and move on to the peach. I first use a mix of Chinese white and Hansa yellow to paint the base color. Then I added vermilion to create a peachy color to paint the bottom as well as the middle portion of the peach, while the base color was still a little bit damp. And for the leaf, I just use sap green. I'm going to use this exact same peach color to paint the drinks on the right hand side as well. I also want to leave out a bit of white negative space for highlights. I forgot to do this on the right hand side, but that's okay because we can go over it again with bleed proof white. For the strawberries, I use the same peach color for the base. Then I just use a thick consistency of vermilion while the surface is still wet to paint from the bottom upwards, creating a soft gradient. As for the leaves, I just use sap green. Moving on to the filling of the sandwich, I use a thin consistency of sap green to paint the lettuce, and I use the same peach color to indicate the ham, and a thin consistency of Hansa yellow for the cheese. Here I'm painting on the filler leaves. I'm just using whatever green I had on my palette just to use up the color. I finally decided to change to a smaller brush because the elements here are very small. For the crackers, I use a mix of yellow ochre, buff titanium, and a bit of gray. And as for the cheese, I use the Hansa yellow and Chinese white mix. Then I use gray of gray to create the ridges on top of the cheese. For the cheese cubes, I want the yellow to be a little bit darker, so I use the same cheese mix as before with added Hansa yellow. Then I use a thinner consistency for the lighter area of the cheese cubes. For the circles, I decided to turn it into the same grapes, so I just used the same color mixture as before. I mentioned earlier that I want the ukulele to have sort of a spring vibe, so I used the peach mixture to paint the neck of the ukulele. Then I use a medium to thick consistency of sap green to paint on some viney leaves on the corners of the body. I want to keep the consistency of the color palette all throughout the composition, so I use the same pink or peach color again to paint the rim of the cups. Then I added a little bit of design along the sides. As for the handle and the stirrer, I use yellow ochre in a thick consistency. Then I use sepia to darken certain areas, and then I use a thin consistency of sepia to paint the T. I'm also going to use a very thick consistency of sepia to paint the ribbon on the hat because I feel the composition is fairly light at the moment and I need the darker colors to add a little bit of pop to the composition. After this, I'm going to quickly go over the crackers again. I use a thick consistency of yellow ochre just to paint the sides. Then I try to soften the edges just to give it more of a baked look around the edges. I'm going to add a bit of texture to the drinks. I used the pink mixture from earlier. One has a little bit more vermilion than the other. Then I just tap very lightly using the tip of my brush to suggest some pulp texture. I felt like the composition still needed some darker colors, which is why I decided to use the consistency of sepia for the cover of the books. But I feel like this was a mistake. Looking at this again, I actually prefer the books to have brighter colors because this ended up making the books look a bit more autumny than spring. For the honey jar, I just use a mix of vermilion and Hansa yellow, and at the bottom I use more vermilion in the mix to make it more orangey while the surface is still wet. As for the spoon, I just use a thick consistency of sepia. Moving on to the bread now, I use a mix of yellow ochre, vermilion, Hansa yellow, and a little bit of sepia. And I'm going to use this color to paint the top part of the bread. Then I use a clean damp brush to lighten or blend the bottom part of the bread. I basically use the same mixture to paint the rest of the bread, but I change up the ratio for a little bit of variation. Here I'm using a thin consistency of yellow ochre to paint on the slits. Then just to make the top part of the bread look a little bit more burnt, I use the same base color with added sepia. For the cloth underneath the bread, I'm going to use a thin consistency of gray just to freehand some of the folds. Then you can use a hair dryer to dry it off completely, because after that I'm going to be using a very thick consistency of vermilion, which you don't want it to bleed out. And I tried to follow the cross contour of the folds to give the cloth a bit of volume. Again, for the book covers, I know I chose the wrong colors because this looks a little bit more autumn than spring. I would suggest for you to use brighter, lighter colors. But I'm not going to redo this whole composition just for those books, so I'm just going to move on and paint on the rest of the details. I use a thick consistency of sepia to paint the ribbon or the belt on the dress. Then I use the yellows and the pinks to paint flower petals to fill in the space. You can use other colors as well. I feel like introducing a little bit of sky blue or a lilac purple would look really nice to this composition to make it a bit more colorful. I'm also going to use a thick consistency of bleed-proof white to add on highlights to the fruits as well as details to the bottles. Here I decided to use a thick consistency of the same peach mix for the bottom area to give the drinks a bit of gradient so it doesn't look so flat. I also went over parts of the tulips, or add on any other details you feel like you need to add or you've missed while you were painting the individual items. Once I'm happy with the details of the individual objects, I'm going to add more fillers. Here I decided to add more leaves and also added leaves to the flowers. And you can add any other smaller elements if you have any other ideas as well. Here I decided to add different shaped flowers, and this one came out a little bit munted, but it doesn't really matter too much since it's just a very small area in the corner. And I'm just going to color it in using the same color palette as the rest of the composition. As I mentioned earlier, this is a good way to introduce other colors to make your composition look more colorful. And I actually somewhat regretted not including lilac into this composition because I feel like it would work great with the other colors. So you might want to do that for your own painting. For the rest of the tiny spaces, I'm either going to add flowers, leaves, or these colorful dots just to make the composition look more happy, and that's pretty much it. Overall, I'm quite happy with the elements that I've included here. The main things that I would change if I were to make this again would be to include purples or blues and also to change the color of the books. But apart from that, this is probably one of my favorite seasons to doodle so far. But yeah, so that's it. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. I will also have the outline available in my coffee shop. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!